Ms. Reynolds, we found a safe behind a false wall. Your sister's name is on it, but please, don't come here alone. At that moment, I didn't know that my own father had been using my sister's identity for years to rob helpless seniors, making her the prime suspect. What I found inside that black box made me recoil in disgust at the man I called Dad. My name is Zoe Reynolds. A year after the silence settled into my grandparents' home, first a sudden heart attack, then a grueling battle with the illness that takes far too much, I decided it was time to breathe life back into their old mountain retreat in Silverthorne. I was navigating the steep, pine-lined curves of the Colorado Pass, heading up to check on the renovation progress, when my phone vibrated against the console. It was Miller, the contractor I'd hired for the job. His voice was uncharacteristically low, clipped with a tension I couldn't place. Ms. Reynolds, we've found something. We just broke through a secondary wall in the loft, and there's a locked digital safe hidden in the crawl space. Your sister's name, Lily Reynolds, is etched right into the lid. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. You need to get up here as soon as possible, Miller continued. And Zoe? Don't come alone. Call your parents. Bring Lily. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. My hands shook as I made the calls, telling them only that something urgent regarding Margaret's estate had surfaced, and that they needed to meet me at the house immediately. When we finally gathered in that dusty loft, standing among the skeletons of exposed beams, and the sharp scent of fresh sawdust, the air felt like lead. We stood in a silent circle around a small, matte black box resting on the subfloor. No one spoke. The atmosphere was suffocating, charged with the weight of a secret that had been waiting in the dark. Staring at my sister's name engraved on that cold steel, I knew that whatever lay inside was about to dismantle every truth I held about my family. The house was a steep-roofed sanctuary perched on a high ridge, surrounded by spruce and aspen trees that sang in the wind. Growing up, Lily and I owned that loft. It was our fortress, a world of wool blankets and flashlights where we told stories until Margaret called us down for a late supper. The massive triangular windows framed the jagged peaks of the Rockies, and we'd spend hours watching storms roll over the Continental Divide or spotting golden eagles circling the valley. Winters were a different kind of magic. We'd huddle by the stone hearth downstairs, roasting sausages on long forks while Arthur spun his usual tall tales about the elk he'd tracked or the trout that got away in the mountain streams. Margaret would be in her worn wingback chair nearby, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, or perhaps quietly reviewing the thick files of her clients. She was a pillar in the community, a financial advisor who specialized in retirement planning, helping local seniors navigate the complexities of trusts and estates to protect their life savings. She often met people right there in the house, using the sun-drenched den off the living room as her office. I'd peek in sometimes and see her patiently translating the jargon of annuities into something a widow could actually understand. But in her final years, the atmosphere in the house shifted. My father, Nathan, started showing up more frequently, often unannounced. He'd corner her in the study for private talks about investment opportunities or client portfolios. His voice was always smooth, draped in a charming concern, but I noticed the way his gaze sharpened whenever she mentioned specific accounts. Margaret would usually steer the conversation back to confidentiality, though Nathan would always press just a little longer, a little harder, each time. Then, the loft changed. The space that had been our childhood clubhouse was suddenly fitted with a heavy deadbolt that no one remembered installing. Lily and I were in our 20s by then, visiting less often, so we didn't ask many questions. We assumed Margaret just needed privacy as her health began to fail, perhaps a place to store medical equipment or sensitive documents away from the prying eyes of grandchildren. Arthur's death was a sudden lightning strike, a heart attack that took him in an instant when I was 28. Margaret fought the cancer that followed for a full year, determined to maintain her independence in the house she loved. She grew frailier, spending most of her days in that same wingback chair by the fire, but her mind remained as sharp as a razor. She handled her own affairs until the very end, ensuring her will left the property directly to Lily and me. She wanted us to have the security of the land, bypassing any complicated family trusts. Lily clung to the idea of preserving the place exactly as Margaret had left it, a museum of our childhood summers. She was always the sentimental one, the sister who kept every holiday ornament and old letter as if they were sacred relics. But the reality of the situation was cold. The house sat empty, accumulating taxes and maintenance costs that we simply couldn't ignore. I had built a career in Denver and was finally finding my footing, but Lily was struggling. A single mother working on a teacher's salary, she was living in a cramped apartment that barely had room for her and the kid. Letting the house fall into disrepair felt like a betrayal of our grandparents' hard work. I eventually convinced her that a renovation was the only way forward. We would turn the loft into a modern, light-filled suite with skylights and polished beams, something that would appeal to the buyers looking for a mountain retreat. Selling the place would give her the breathing room she needed to finally buy a home of her own. That was how Miller's crew ended up in the loft. They were experts in these high-altitude A-frames, accustomed to the odd angles and the damage the mountain winters can do. A few weeks into the job, they had stripped the old paneling and were prepping for the new layout. During one of my visits, I noticed Margaret's old armchair still tucked in the corner. I saw faint pry marks around the lock of the side drawer, scratches that hadn't been there when she was alive. She had once mentioned misplacing some paperwork during her treatments, but I dismissed it as a side effect of the medication. I sat there on the cold plywood floor of the loft, the wind whistling through the unfinished walls, staring at the empty black box. The silence of the mountain felt heavy, echoing with the realization that our family history was about to be rewritten in a way none of us were prepared for. The property sat idle for a long time, becoming a heavy cycle of taxes and repair bills that we simply could no longer justify. I had established myself in Denver, 3 hours south, working in marketing and saving for a future that finally felt within reach. Lily, however, was barely keeping her head above water. Between her job at the local preschool and the fallout of a bitter divorce, she was struggling to make rent on a place that felt more like a hallway than a home for her and her son. Letting the family house deteriorate felt like an insult to the people who had built it. I was the one who insisted on the renovation, reimagining the loft as a sleek, mountain modern suite to attract the buyers who were currently flooding the high country. Selling would give Lily a fresh start and me the security I'd been working for. That's how Miller's crew ended up with the contract. They were experts in these high-altitude A-frames, the steep pitches, the snow-load logistics, the specific way the wood needs to breathe. We started with the loft to maximize the listing's visual impact. A few weeks in, they were already stripping the old paneling. I remember seeing Margaret's wingback chair during one of my walkthroughs, still tucked in a corner. The wood around its side drawer was scarred with fresh pry marks, scratches that hadn't been there when she was alive. She'd mentioned losing some paperwork once, blaming it on the fog of her treatments, and I'd just nodded, thinking it was a minor symptom of her health declining. Heading up the pass that morning for what I thought was a routine check, my chest was tight, with a mix of nostalgia and grief. The house was a tapestry of joy and loss, lazy summers chasing mountain bluebirds, Thanksgiving dinners where the table groaned under the weight of Arthur's favorite dishes, and quiet nights listening to jazz on his old turntable. Renovating meant erasing those traces, but keeping the house a tomb honored no one. Lily had eventually agreed, her practicality finally winning out over her sentimentality. If only I'd known that the crew's demolition would uncover far more than just bad wiring or dry rot. The drive up the pass that morning was a blur. The second Miller hung up, I pushed the car harder than I ever had, tires humming against the sharp curves as the autumn leaves whipped past the glass. My mind was a storm. Why was Lily's name on a hidden box? Why did he sound so rattled? By the time the gravel of the driveway crunched under my wheels, the crew had cleared out to give me space. Miller was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He handed me a pair of work gloves and pointed toward the loft without a word. The air upstairs was thick with dust and the sharp scent of old pine. The box was sitting on a tarp in the center of the exposed floorboards, a sleek, matte black digital safe that looked far too modern for this house. Lily Reynolds was engraved on the top in clean, block letters. No date, no other markings. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest as I knelt beside it. I knew these safes, they usually lock out after 3 wrong attempts, sometimes erasing their contents entirely as a security measure. Margaret had been increasingly concerned about identity theft in her final years, always shielding her tablet. First try, her birthday. A red light and a sharp beep. Second try, Arthur's birthday. Another denial. My pulse thudded in my ears. One more mistake and the truth might be gone forever. I closed my eyes and pictured her at the oak kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She was a creature of habit and deep sentiment. The anniversary. The day Arthur had brought her those same yellow roses every single year for 5 decades. I punched in the numbers slowly. A soft, mechanical click followed by a steady green glow. The lid released. Inside lay a single envelope of heavy cream stationery and a folded note. No tech, no USB drives, just the handwriting I'd known my whole life. The envelope was addressed simply, for Zoe or Lily. Open only if I'm gone. The seal had yellowed, the tape brittle from the mountain air. I sat cross-legged on the plywood subfloor, the wind rattling the loose shingles outside, and carefully slid it open. The letter spanned 3 pages in her distinctive, neat script, though it grew ragged toward the end, written in the frantic bursts of clarity between her medication. My dearest granddaughters, if you are reading this, it means I ran out of time to fix this myself. I have suspected for many months that your father, Nathan, has been doing something unforgivable with my clients' retirement funds. My stomach turned over. It started with small things, odd questions about specific accounts, pushing for introductions to wealthier seniors. Then I found the discrepancies. Money was moving in ways that didn't make sense, routed through entities I couldn't easily trace. The worst part, every suspicious transaction I've uncovered so far is tied to information that should only belong to Lily. Her social security number, her old addresses, even forged signatures that are disturbingly accurate. I don't yet know how deep this goes, but the pattern is clear enough to terrify me. If the authorities ever look into this, Lily will be the first person they flag because everything points to her. I read the words again, my vision blurring. I've been gathering what I can, call logs, bank alerts, printouts, but my strength is fading faster than I expected. The second sheet has the login for a secure cloud folder where I've uploaded copies of everything. A colleague is helping me keep it updated when I can't. Use it carefully. Please, whatever you do, protect your sister. Don't let her take the fall for a crime she knows nothing about. I wanted to confront Nathan directly, but the cancer won that race. I am so sorry, I couldn't finish this for you. All my love, Margaret. It began with a few subtle inquiries, odd questions about specific accounts, Nathan pushing for introductions to my wealthier friends. Then, discrepancies began to surface in the statements I reviewed for neighbors. Money was moving in ways that defied logic, always routed through entities that vanished the moment I tried to trace them. But the worst part, the part that breaks my heart, is that every suspicious transaction I've uncovered so far is tied to information that should only belong to Lily. Her social security number, her old addresses, even forged signatures that are disturbingly accurate. I don't yet know how deep this rot goes, but the pattern is clear enough to terrify me. If the authorities ever look into this, Lily will be the first person they target, because every digital footprint bears her name. I've been gathering what I can, call logs, bank alerts, printouts, but my strength is fading faster than I expected. The second sheet in this envelope contains the login details for a secure cloud folder where I've uploaded copies of everything. A colleague is helping me keep it updated when I am too weak to sit at the desk. Use it carefully. Please, Zoe, whatever you do, protect your sister. Do not let her take the fall for a crime she knows nothing about. I wanted to confront Nathan directly to force the truth out of him, but the cancer is winning that race. I am so sorry, I couldn't finish this for you. All my love, Margaret. The words blurred as the tears finally spilled over. She had carried this weight alone, shielding us while her own body was falling apart. Guilt, rage, and a sickening confusion crashed into me all at once. How long had she known? Why hadn't she told me? And what, exactly, had my father done to us? The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose shingles on the roof, echoing the storm brewing in my chest. I folded the letter with trembling hands, slipped the cloud credentials into my pocket, and sat there on the dusty plywood floor, staring at the empty black box that had just dismantled the foundation of our lives. The drive back to Denver felt like an eternity. The winding mountain roads eventually gave way to the monotonous hum of the interstate as dusk settled over the Front Range. My mind was a broken record, replaying Margaret's words over and over, the shaky handwriting, the desperate plea to protect Lily. By the time I unlocked my apartment door in the city, exhaustion was battling with a cold, sharp dread. I set the letter on the kitchen table, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and opened my laptop. The credentials on the note were simple: a URL, and a password that combined her wedding year with a phrase she'd always used for her private files, SEC Uranus 1958. Logging in took only seconds. The dashboard loaded slowly, a basic cloud service she'd likely set up with help from her office. There was no polished organization here, the files were scattered, as if she'd uploaded them in frantic bursts between doctor appointments and rounds of morphine. Several videos were corrupted, cutting off mid-sentence, and many of the scans were pixelated, the result of shaky hands and poor lighting. Her illness had clearly turned this into a grueling labor of love. The first folder contained scanned notes from her client meetings. The pages, dated over the last 3 years, were written in her meticulous style: client names, retirement balances, investment types, but red flags jumped out immediately. Certain accounts were missing from her official firm records, though they appeared in the private banking portals she had accessed. One entry noted a widow's $400,000 nest egg transferred to an unfamiliar LLC. Another mentioned a retired couple's annuity cashed out prematurely, the funds rerouted through a shell account. Deeper in were bank screenshots, blurry and taken in dim light. The transfers were traced back to accounts bearing Lily's full name and social security number. The forged signatures were visible even in low resolution. In one instance, her middle name was misspelled, a sloppy mistake by someone moving too fast. The pattern was undeniable. Small diversions at first, building to massive sums as Margaret grew weaker. She had annotated some of them with digital sticky notes: "Why Lily's info. Client denied authorizing." Then, I found the audio files. They were short video call recordings, time-stamped during her final months. Sarah Vance, her longtime colleague from the firm, must have guided the setup. They used a secure app for remote recording, likely to avoid detection. I clicked the first one. Margaret appeared on the screen, pale and incredibly frail in the hospital bed we had set up in the den. Her voice was weak, but her tone was sharp, probing. "Nathan, about the Sterling account, the one you recommended to her son. She says the funds have vanished. Explain it to me again." My father's face filled the other half of the screen. He was in his home office, the light catching the gold on his golf trophies in the background. He laughed it off at first, that easy, practiced charm he used on everyone. "Mom, you're letting the meds cloud your head. I just advised them on diversification." But Margaret pressed him, feigning a confusion brought on by her painkillers. "The routing, it shows Lily's details. Why is her social security number on the transfer?" Nathan hesitated. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just a placeholder account for the routing process. She doesn't need to know the details, Mom. It's better that way." The recording cut abruptly. File incomplete. I clicked the next one, dated weeks later. Margaret was listing specific unauthorized transfers, her voice a fragile rasp. Nathan's tone had shifted from charming to sharp and defensive. "Those people trusted me because of you, Mom. It's just business." There was a long pause, and then his voice dropped into a low, cold register that made my skin crawl. Lily's information was convenient. She has a clean record. No one asks questions when her name is on the paperwork. The recording ended with a heavy, rattling sigh from Margaret. It was the sound of a woman realizing her own son was a stranger. He hadn't confessed in so many words, but the evasions painted a grotesque picture. He had hollowed out the lives of the people who trusted his mother, siphoned their medical funds, and nest eggs, and then wore my sister's identity like a mask to ensure she would take the fall if the floor ever gave way. Under federal statutes like the Elder Justice Act, systemic fraud and identity theft against seniors carry penalties of up to 20 years. I sat there in the dark, cross-referencing names from the cloud files with public records on my phone. One victim was a retired librarian who'd lost her entire pension. Another was a veteran whose disability supplement had vanished into a shell company. All of it was linked to the consulting firm Nathan had bragged about at every family dinner. The emotional weight was staggering. Margaret had been trapped, her professional ethics as a licensed advisor clashing with a maternal instinct that refused to condemn her son without ironclad proof. By midnight, with my eyes burning from the screen's blue glare, the betrayal had crystallized. Nathan hadn't just made a mistake, he had systematically exploited his mother's network and sabotaged his own daughter's future to fund his lifestyle. The incomplete files were frustrating, missing links in the transaction chains and garbled audio from poor connections. Enough remained to demand action. Sarah's involvement made sense now. She had likely coached Margaret on the secure backups, knowing the risks of digital trails under privacy laws. I shut the laptop and paced my small living room, the streetlights outside flickering through the blinds. The pieces fit too neatly, too cruelly. Tomorrow I would call Sarah for clarity, but tonight the truth settled in my gut like lead. Our family harbored a secret destroyer. I texted Lily the next morning, asking her to meet me at a small, independent coffee shop on the edge of the valley, a place with mismatched chairs, and the kind of strong espresso we'd favored since our college days. She replied quickly, suggesting lunch since her shift at the preschool ended early. Driving back up the pass, the familiar route felt heavier this time. Every mile closed the gap between suspicion and confrontation. Lily arrived first, already seated at a corner table with 2 lattes waiting. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman trying to keep too many plates spinning, but she smiled when she saw me. We hugged longer than usual, the kind of embrace that lingers when something unspoken hangs in the air. I didn't waste any time once we sat down. I slid my phone across the table, showing her the screenshots from the cloud folder, the forged account statements bearing her name, the transfer trails leading away from the elderly clients Margaret had spent her life protecting. Her face went pale, the blood draining away until she looked as frail as our grandmother had in those videos. At first, it was denial. This can't be right, Zoe. Someone must have hacked my information. Then she kept scrolling, and the denial began to crack. Wait, she whispered. Those letters from the bank years ago. The ones asking me to verify accounts I never opened. I thought they were just sophisticated scams. I shredded them. She stopped on a blurry scan of a signature. And the divorce, my ex was waving printouts in my face, accusing me of hiding money. He said my credit was trash because of secret debts I refused to acknowledge. I swore to the judge I hadn't done anything. The more she talked, the clearer the sabotage became. Nathan had timed everything with surgical precision, opening lines of credit in her name just as her marriage was beginning to strain. He'd maxed out cards she didn't know existed, tanking her score so that a loan for a car or a decent house became an impossibility. Her ex, convinced she was lying about their finances, had walked out citing her irresponsibility. Child support battles had dragged on for years because judges saw delinquent accounts on her record. Even job offers had vanished after background checks flagged fraud alerts tied to her social security number. Lily's hands were shaking so hard the phone rattled against the table. Shock was shifting into something fiercer. All this time, I blamed myself. I thought I was just bad with money, that I'd made some horrible mistakes I couldn't remember. Turns out, he was doing it to me. On purpose. Her voice cracked, anger finally rising to the surface. We paid the bill and left, deciding the fresh mountain air might help us clear our heads. Instead of heading home, I suggested a detour. One victim's name had stood out in Margaret's notes, Mrs. Evelyn Whittaker, an 83-year-old former school principal who had lost nearly $400,000 meant for her grandchildren's college funds. The assisted living facility sat on the outskirts of town, a low brick building with manicured gardens. We checked in at the front desk, explaining we were relatives of Margaret Reynolds seeking to follow up on a few personal matters. The staff led us to a sunlit common room where Mrs. Whittaker sat by a large window, her fingers swollen with arthritis as she worked on a wool scarf. She welcomed us warmly, her eyes lighting up when I mentioned Margaret. She was such a sharp lady, Mrs. Whittaker said. She always looked out for us old folks. I treaded lightly, showing Mrs. Whittaker the printed summaries while watching her eyes. Her expression shifted, darkening as she recalled the meetings. He was a consultant, she said softly, her voice thin. Your grandmother recommended him. A very polite man in his 50s, always in a sharp suit. He promised higher yields on conservative investments. He called himself Julian Vane. He said he was a partner at Margaret's firm. She told us about the multiple visits and the papers she had signed, her memory sharp despite her years. After the funds were transferred, the statements just stopped coming or showed zero balances. I called Margaret, frantic, tears pooled in the creases of her eyes. She promised to look into it, but then her health failed. I never recovered a cent. I had to let go of so many dreams for my grandkids. When I asked if she had ever dealt directly with anyone named Lily, she shook her head firmly. I've never met or spoken to a soul by that name. It was always Mr. Vane. He handled everything. The confirmation hit Lily like a physical blow. She gripped my hand under the table, her knuckles white and bloodless. Mrs. Whittaker's story was a mirror image of the files I had found, the same amounts, the same timeline, the same hollow assurances. As we left the facility, Lily walked with a new kind of posture. The self-doubt that had plagued her for years was being replaced by a cold, sharp fury. Every failure she had blamed herself for, every financial hurdle that had ruined her life, had been engineered by the man who was supposed to be her father. In the parking lot, she turned to me, her eyes hard. We can't let this stand, Zoe. Whatever it takes. The next morning, I called the number Margaret had left in the cloud notes. A warm but guarded voice answered on the third ring. Grace Miller speaking. I introduced myself and mentioned the hidden files. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. These things are better handled face to face, she said. We met that afternoon at her office in the valley, a quiet suite overlooking the pine-covered slopes. Grace was a woman of silver hair and sharp eyes, looking out through rimless glasses. We sat with steaming coffee between us as I laid out the summaries I had prepared. Margaret confided in me toward the end, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. We argued about it. I told her to go to the authorities immediately. Elder exploitation is a mandatory report for advisors under federal rules. But she refused. She was terrified that any premature move would backfire on Lily. She explained the tension of those final months. Margaret had wanted an airtight case, so the investigators would see through the framing the moment they opened the file. She knew that identity theft layered over fraud made Lily the primary suspect in any standard probe. I helped her set up that cloud account, Grace continued. I taught her the basics during our lunch breaks while her strength was failing. We were racing the clock. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. You're doing the right thing. I still consult for a federal agent who specializes in these kinds of predatory schemes. Agent Marcus Thorne. He's seen identity theft rings targeting retirement assets before. With my consent, she called him and put the phone on speaker. Thorne's voice was calm, professional, and carried the weight of experience. "Grace's referrals are always solid," he said. "Send what you have through our secure portal. I'll review it tonight." Uploading those files from my apartment that evening felt surreal. Bank trails, audio clips, handwritten lists, everything was finally in official hands. Thorne called back sooner than I expected. "The evidence is impressive," he admitted. "I see a clear pattern of unauthorized transfers totaling over 1.8 million across 6 different victims. All of it was routed through accounts in your sister's name. It's a strong case for prosecution, but the framing is sophisticated." He warned us of the risks. Without a careful presentation, the standard protocol would flag the account holder first. Lily could face subpoenas or asset freezes before we even have a chance to pivot to the real perpetrator. If your father claims ignorance or blames it on forged documents, Lily's explanation might not hold up. We need him on the record acknowledging control. Thorne suggested a controlled setting, a family gathering where the conversation could be legally recorded. Colorado law allowed for one-party consent in felony investigations, meaning if I hosted the meeting and consented to the recording, we didn't need a warrant for the audio. We had to lead Nathan into a trap of his own making. No warrants were needed. Grace joined the follow-up call to help us script the final act. The house in Silverthorne provided the perfect trap, neutral ground, deeply tied to Margaret's estate, offering a plausible reason for a family meeting. We crafted a careful invitation, a group text claiming the contractors had found unfiled trust amendments hidden in the loft wall, legal addendums that required immediate signatures to finalize the probate distribution. In Colorado, probate can be a bureaucratic nightmare, and the threat of a delayed inheritance made the excuse bulletproof. My parents drove up from their suburban home outside of Denver, while Lily made the short trip from her apartment. Agent Thorne had coached me on the art of subtlety: keep the conversation natural, steer it toward Margaret's final professional concerns, and never lead with an accusation. I was to let the silence do the heavy lifting. I propped my phone on the table in plain sight to serve as a backup audio source, legal under the state's one-party consent rules since I was a participant in the room. There were no hidden bugs, nothing that could be thrown out in court for violating interception laws. Thorne and his team would be monitoring the audio remotely from a nearby vehicle, ready to move in if things turned volatile. The plan felt solid, yet as the weekend arrived with its crisp mountain air and blindingly clear skies, my nerves were frayed. Grace had squeezed my hand before I left her office. "Margaret would be proud of you for finishing this, Zoe." The stakes were staggering: justice for the victims and the survival of my sister's future. I was about to go to war with the men who had raised me, but delay was no longer an option. Every hour we waited gave Nathan another chance to scrub his digital trail. My parents pulled into the gravel driveway first, their SUV packed with overnight bags. Lily arrived shortly after, her older sedan looking small and fragile next to their car. We gathered in the living room, the autumn sun streaming through the massive triangular windows, casting long shadows across the stone fireplace. I positioned my laptop on the coffee table, the screen facing the room. We started with the mundane: Lily's preschool class, my mother's garden club. Eventually, Nathan steered the talk toward the house sale, his eyes flickering with an impatience for timelines and numbers. I shifted gears. "Before we settle the estate, there's something from Margaret's private files the crew uncovered. It concerns some of her old clients." I opened the playlist. The volume was moderate, but the silence in the room made every word carry. The first clip played, Margaret's frail, labored voice questioning irregular transfers. Nathan's voice followed, dismissive and casual, attributing the losses to market fluctuations. On the sofa, Nathan's posture stiffened. He forced a dry chuckle. "This is being taken completely out of context, Zoe. Your grandmother was on heavy medication toward the end. She was experiencing hallucinations, confusion, we all saw it." My mother nodded beside him, reaching for his hand. Let's not dredge up these painful memories, girls. Margaret wouldn't want us at each other's throats. I didn't argue. I simply clicked the next file, a recording of bank routing details tied directly to Lily's credentials. Nathan's denials turned sharp, his voice gaining an edge. These are digital tricks. Anyone can manipulate audio these days. Lily sat rigid, her eyes locked on the screen, her breathing shallow. Then a clearer exchange rolled through the speakers. Margaret began listing specific victims: Mrs. Whittaker, the retired librarian, the veteran. In the recording, Nathan finally stopped laughing. He admitted on tape that having access through her introductions was convenient. The charm finally cracked. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into that cold, manipulative register I had heard during 1,000 childhood arguments. Fine. Let's say some investments didn't go as planned. Margaret always favored Lily, didn't she? Shielding her from every consequence, bailing her out of every mess. I had to build something for myself. My mother murmured a quiet agreement, her voice thick with a twisted sense of loyalty. Margaret did spoil the youngest. It created a lot of resentment in this family. She admitted it then, that she had known about the irregularities, but chose the sanctuary of silence. Families protect their own, she whispered. Exposing it would have destroyed us. Nathan's defense crumbled into a jagged, ugly bitterness. Margaret introduced me to those wealthy retirees, and then acted shocked when I maximized the opportunities. Using Lily's details was the only logical move. She never would have noticed, she was too busy with her failing marriage and her pathetic little job. No one was ever going to believe her over me. He began to list his tactics with a sickening sense of pride, describing the shell companies, and the way he timed transfers during market dips to mask the thefts. He spoke about the funds he'd diverted into his own lifestyle upgrades, as if it were a commission he had earned. Those old people had more than they could ever spend, he spat. I earned that money. Lily's breathing became ragged, tears finally streaking her face. I kept my voice steady, asking the questions Thorne had scripted for me, drawing out the specifics of the forged forms and the deliberate sabotage of Lily's credit. He boasted about the precision of it all, how Lily's clean history had provided the perfect canopy. By the time anyone actually looked at the books, Nathan said, his eyes cold as flint, she was the one who was going to take the heat. My mother shifted uncomfortably, but her voice remained low and steady. I thought it would stay small, Zoe. I didn't want the family name dragged through the mud. The room grew suffocating. The childhood photos on the mantel seemed to stare down at us like silent, judging witnesses. Nathan's arrogance had reached its zenith. You think turning this over changes anything? He sneered. Blood is thicker than some old files. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. I looked out over the valley and gave the signal. 2 flashes of headlights from the unmarked vehicles parked down the ridge. The front door didn't just open, it was reclaimed. Agent Thorne entered first, his badge catching the slanting mountain light, followed by 2 officers. Nathan Reynolds, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial exploitation. My father's face went the color of ash as the cuffs clicked shut. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily remained frozen, a chaotic mix of horror and profound relief washing over her. As Thorne recited the Miranda rights, Nathan offered no resistance, just a stunned, hollow compliance in the very room where we had once celebrated Christmas. They led him out past the stone hearth and the faded portraits. My mother followed them to the porch, calling his name in a weak, fluttering voice. Inside, Lily and I stayed behind, the weight of 20 years finally lifting and crashing down all at once. Nathan's arrogance had reached its zenith. He looked at us with a cold, mocking pity. You really think turning this over changes anything? Blood is thicker than water, Zoe. I didn't answer. I stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking the gravel driveway. It was the prearranged signal. I watched as the headlights of two unmarked vehicles flashed twice from the darkness of the tree line. The front door opened without a knock. Agent Thorne entered first, his badge visible in the dimming mountain light, followed by two federal officers in plain clothes. "Nathan Reynolds, you are under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial exploitation." My father's face went the color of ash as the steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. My mother gasped, her hand clutching the arm of the sofa, as if the world were tilting. Lily stood frozen, a chaotic mix of horror and profound relief washing over her features. Thorne recited the Miranda rights with a practiced, hollow calm, while the officers secured the room. There was no resistance, only a stunned, heavy compliance in the middle of the very room where we had once celebrated Christmases and birthdays. They led him out past the stone fireplace and the faded family portraits. My mother followed them to the threshold, calling his name in a weak, desperate voice. Lily and I stayed behind, the weight of 20 years finally lifting and crashing down simultaneously. The arrest was efficient, standard procedure for white-collar crime. There were no dramatic outbursts. The vehicles eventually pulled away down the winding mountain road, leaving a silence in the house that felt irrevocably changed. The investigation stretched across the following months. Federal agents spent hundreds of hours combing through layers of shell companies and offshore routing that Nathan had buried deep within the financial system. Prosecutors built an airtight case under the Elder Justice Act. The evidence from Margaret's hidden safe, combined with his own recorded admissions, left him with no room to move. To avoid a trial that could have added decades to his time, he accepted a plea deal, 22 years in a federal facility in Englewood, Colorado, with no possibility of early parole. The asset forfeiture followed with clinical speed. The family home, 4 bedrooms and a manicured lawn, all bought with the stolen futures of his clients, went to public auction. The luxury cars, the investment portfolios, even the collectibles from his office were seized and liquidated. The proceeds were directed toward restitution. Nearly 88% of the stolen funds were eventually returned to the victims. Mrs. Whitaker received enough to restore her grandchildren's college funds and cover the costs of her long-term care. Others were able to rebuild their depleted nest eggs, moving from the brink of poverty back to a life of modest security. The government process was slow, but in the end, a substantial justice prevailed. My mother chose loyalty to the end. She sold what little remained in her name and moved into a small, nondescript apartment near the prison. She attended every visitation allowed, writing him letters that we never asked to read. Lily and I chose a different path. When his letters arrived for us, pleas for understanding, hollow claims of remorse, we returned them unopened. We changed our numbers and blocked his accounts. No contact was the only boundary that allowed us to breathe. Lily's recovery was slow, but it gained momentum. With the help of the federal investigators, the fraud reports were cleared from her record through the identity theft affidavit process. The black marks that had haunted her for a decade were erased. Her credit score climbed steadily. Within 18 months, she qualified for a modest loan on a 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet suburb of Denver, close enough for us to see each other every weekend, far enough from the ghosts of the mountains. Teaching preschool brought her a renewed sense of purpose. Her colleagues noticed her newfound confidence, and she was eventually promoted to a coordinator role with better pay. I shifted my own career, taking a remote position that allowed me to be nearby. Our weekends were now filled with the simple, honest work of helping her unpack, painting rooms, and building a routine that wasn't shadowed by debt or suspicion. The sale of the A-frame finally closed without a hitch. The proceeds were split evenly, providing Lily with a financial cushion, and me with the stability I had long craved. Watching her sign the closing papers, keys in hand for a place that was truly hers, marked the real turning point in our lives. Cutting ties wasn't easy. The holidays felt strange at first, the traditions were gone, and the birthdays were much quieter. But we learned that toxicity has no place in a life meant for healing. Blood ties do not obligate the endurance of betrayal. Looking back, the hardest truth Margaret left behind wasn't just the evidence, it was the lesson in courage. She had fought alone to shield us, sacrificing her own peace of mind for the sake of our integrity. Lily and I honor that sacrifice by protecting our future with the same fierce boundaries. We learned that some relationships simply cannot be salvaged, and trying to force them only prolongs the pain. Walking away from a parent, even a biological one, isn't always abandonment. Sometimes it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Family isn't always defined by DNA. It is built on actions, on respect, and on an unwavering honesty. Lily and I created our family from scratch, stronger than before, without the crushing weight of deception. The victims regained their dignity through restitution, and we regained ours through the truth. Peace didn't come from a forced forgiveness. It came from accepting the reality of who our father was and choosing to move forward, finally unburdened.